In a warehouse outside Louisville, Kentucky, barrels of bourbon are aging for a market that 18 months ago simply vanished. Jack Daniel's, Jim Beam, and dozens of smaller American brands were pulled off government store shelves across Canada almost overnight in March 2025. And as of this week, most of them are still gone. This is the story of how a political gesture became one of the most damaging trade weapons either country has used against the other, and how, even as Ottawa and Washington edge toward a deal, the American alcohol industry finds itself bleeding from two directions at once. One wound from Canada, and one that has nothing to do with Canada at all. To understand why that warehouse full of aging bourbon matters, you have to go back further than March 2025. In February of that year, President Trump signed an executive order imposing 25% tariffs on nearly all Canadian exports, citing a declared national security emergency, with a reduced 10% rate carved out for energy, critical minerals, and potash. It was, according to trade analysts tracking the move, the first time that particular emergency tariff authority had been used this broadly against a close U.S. ally, and Canada did not sit still. Ottawa responded with retaliatory 25% tariffs of its own on roughly $30 billion worth of American goods, and signaled it was prepared to expand those countermeasures significantly if tensions continued to escalate. They did. Start with the moment the alcohol fight itself began. In early March 2025, in direct response to President Donald Trump's tariffs on Canadian goods, provincial liquor authorities across the country began stripping American wine, beer, and spirits from their shelves. Because provinces like Ontario and Quebec run government liquor monopolies, this wasn't a slow consumer boycott building over months. It was a single administrative order executed in days. The Liquor Control Board of Ontario, one of the largest single purchasers of alcohol on the planet, pulled every American product it carried. Ontario Premier Doug Ford said at the time that the LCBO alone sold nearly $1 billion of American alcohol every year, and that, as of that Tuesday, every one of those products was off the shelf. Quebec's SAQ did the same. British Columbia went further, with Premier David Eby directing BC liquor stores to specifically stop buying from what he called red states, states that had voted for Trump in 2024, and ordering staff to physically remove the most popular of those brands from view. At the time, the reaction from the American side was one of dismissive confidence. Brown-Forman, the Louisville-based company behind Jack Daniel's, brushed off the immediate financial exposure. On an earnings call, CEO Lawson Whiting acknowledged that Canada accounted for only about 1% of the company's total global sales, so the firm could absorb the initial hit. But Whiting did not dismiss the symbolism. He called Canada's response disproportionate and said, in terms that would later be echoed constantly by American trade officials, that pulling products off shelves entirely was worse than a tariff because it didn't just tax the product, it erased the sale altogether. That phrase, worse than a tariff, became one of the defining lines of the entire dispute, repeated in Washington hearings and White House statements for the next year and a half. Whiting also flagged a second front that rarely made headlines the way Canada did. Mexico, facing the same 25% tariffs, represented about 7% of Brown-Forman's global sales, a far larger exposure than Canada's, roughly 1%. But it was the Canadian boycott, not the Mexican tariff, that became the industry's rallying cry, precisely because it wasn't a tax on the product. It was a removal of the product, full stop. And that distinction is what made it feel to American producers uniquely punishing. The diplomatic temperature around the dispute matched the economic one. Pete Hoekstra, the U.S. ambassador to Canada, was quoted describing Canada's posture in the trade fight as mean and nasty to deal with. A characterization Canadian officials pushed back on, but that stuck in American press coverage of the dispute for months afterward. Some of that friction traced back to Trump's own repeated public musings at various points during 2025 about Canada becoming the 51st American state, remarks that Canadian officials and ordinary citizens alike treated as a serious insult rather than a joke, and that helped harden public support for the alcohol boycott specifically as a form of national pushback. By the summer of 2025, the two countries had reached a partial deal exempting roughly half of goods compliant with the existing North American trade agreement from the ongoing tariffs, and Canada scaled back some of its retaliatory levies in response. But the provincial alcohol bans were notably not part of that partial rollback. They stayed in place, a visible ongoing irritant even as other parts of the relationship cooled down. What nobody in Louisville or Washington fully priced in the spring of 2025 was how long the boycott would hold, and how deep it would cut once the data started arriving. Fast forward to January 2026, and new export figures from Canada began painting a picture that even skeptics of the boycott's effectiveness had to take seriously. As reported by The Independent, Brown-Forman's own organic net sales to Canada had plummeted 60% in the first half of its 2026 fiscal year. Jim Beam's parent company faced such a steep decline, driven by both the Canadian boycott and a broader softening of international demand tied to the wider tariff war that it suspended production entirely at its flagship distillery. Smaller producers were hit even harder. Distillers in states like Minnesota reported sales collapses of 70%, severe enough that some began shipping their production north and contracting with Canadian distillers just to keep their brands technically available in the market they had just been locked out of. By the time the White House formally cited the numbers months later, the scale of the damage was undeniable, whatever your politics. According to a White House fact sheet tied to a new round of tariffs, American alcoholic beverage exports to Canada fell 81% between March 2025 and February 2026, a decline the administration valued at roughly $582 million. The Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, the industry's own trade group, put total American liquor exports down 8% for 2025 as a whole, a figure that understates the Canadian-specific pain because it blends in markets that were unaffected. Separately, American wine sales into Canada were reported to have fallen by $343 million in 2025 alone. Whichever set of numbers you trust most, they all point the same direction. A market that once represented real, stable revenue for American producers had been reduced in the space of about a year to a fraction of its former size. The human cost inside these companies followed the financial one. Brown-Forman had already been cutting jobs before the boycott even began, a fact worth being honest about rather than folding entirely into the Canada story. In January of the prior year, the company announced it was laying off roughly 648 employees, about 12% of its workforce, closing its Louisville barrel-making cooperative and outsourcing that operation, citing a 10-year low in its stock price and 4 consecutive quarters of declining sales. Those cuts were driven primarily by a separate, longer-running trend. Younger American consumers drinking less, a Surgeon General recommendation for health warning labels on alcoholic beverages, and a shift among some consumers toward cannabis instead of alcohol in states where it's legal. The Canadian boycott didn't create that underlying weakness. It arrived on top of it, and for a company already absorbing layoffs and closing facilities, an 81% collapse in a formerly reliable export market was not a rounding error. It was accelerant on a fire that was already burning. That underlying weakness deserves its own moment because it's the second crisis hiding inside this story, and it has nothing to do with Ottawa, tariffs, or Section 338. On August 20th, 2026, Gallup released its latest consumption habit survey, and the headline number should worry the American alcohol industry as much as anything happening at the Canadian border. Just 54% of American adults now say they drink alcohol at all, tying last year's mark as the lowest share Gallup has recorded since it began asking the question back in 1939. That's not a small dip. Gallup's own trend data shows the share of Americans who drink falling from 62% in 2023 to 58% in 2024 to 54% in both 2025 and 2026, a sustained multi-year decline, not a one-time blip. Gallup's Lydia Saad told reporters that last year's drop could have been a one-time reaction, but this year's repeat result tells them whatever's happening out there is a sustained change. Even among Americans who still drink, the average number of weekly drinks has fallen well below the 5-pole historical average, and a record low share of drinkers admit to sometimes drinking too much. The decline cuts across nearly every demographic Gallup tracks, though unevenly. Since 2023, the share of American women who report drinking has dropped 10 percentage points, compared with a 6-point drop among men. Republicans and independents have pulled back sharply, down roughly 11 to 12 percentage points since 2023, while Democrats have barely moved, dropping only about 1 point over the same stretch. Gallup also found that a majority of Americans, 51%, now believe drinking 1 or 2 alcoholic beverages a day is bad for their health, up sharply from just 26% back in 2016, while 40% say it makes no difference either way. 86% of respondents told Gallup they were aware of recent research on alcohol's long-term health effects, up from 79% just 2 years earlier, meaning the shift in behavior is tracking almost exactly with a shift in what Americans believe the science says. One demographic split stood out to Gallup's researchers as particularly telling. Drinking habits barely moved at all among Americans who attend religious services weekly, holding steady near 48%, while every other major group tracked, including nearly every age bracket, showed measurable declines since 2023. In other words, American attitudes toward alcohol itself are shifting, driven by new research on long-term health effects, and that shift shows no sign of reversing. It's worth pausing on how unusual this is historically. Gallup's trend line, which stretches back to 1939, shows that at least 60% of American adults reported drinking every year from 1997 through 2023, a 26-year stretch of relative stability. The only comparable low point in the entire 87-year survey history was 55%, recorded once in 1958. The highs, by contrast, came in the late 1970s, when as many as 71% of Americans told Gallup they drank. Seen against that backdrop, the current 54% isn't just a bad year for the industry. It's arguably the most significant multi-year shift in American drinking behavior that Gallup has ever recorded. And it's happening at the exact same moment American producers are losing access to one of their largest and most reliable foreign markets. So when people talk about America's alcohol crisis, the Canadian trade war is only half of the picture. The domestic market that Brown-Forman, Jim Beam, and every craft distillery in Kentucky and Tennessee depend on is shrinking on its own, tariffs or no tariffs. Put those two forces together, and you get an industry squeezed from both ends at once, a shrinking market at home and a boycotted market abroad. And that combination is exactly what has made the political fight over Canadian shelves so consequential in Washington. It is one thing to lose a foreign market when your domestic base is growing and can absorb the hit. It is another thing entirely when both are contracting simultaneously. That reality is almost certainly why Washington escalated the alcohol dispute so aggressively over the past several months, treating it not as a minor irritant, but as a genuine political priority worth threatening 50% tariffs over. Back on the Canadian side of the border, the picture in early 2026 wasn't uniformly grim for everyone. While American producers were losing shelf space, Canadian producers were gaining it, and provincial liquor authorities were actively encouraging the swap. Quebec's SAQ reported in its annual results that sales of what it labels Origine Quebec products, alcohol made within the province, grew 69. 4%, a surge directly tied to the vacuum left by American brands and to a broader wave of Buy Canadian sentiment that swept the country after Trump's tariffs and, at various points, his musings about Canada becoming the 51st American state. For Quebec's domestic producers, the boycott wasn't a cost. It was the best marketing campaign they never had to pay for. All of this was unfolding against a larger backdrop of strain in the broader Canada-US trading relationship that went well beyond alcohol. The United States had already declined to renew the existing North American trade agreement in its current form during that agreement's mandatory 6-year review, triggering years of ongoing annual negotiations over its future rather than a clean renewal. Analysts covering the dispute, including Sylvain Charlebois, warned that opening a fresh front over provincial liquor monopolies only complicated Canada's negotiating position at a moment when the broader trade relationship with its largest trading partner was already growing more uncertain by the month. And the pain wasn't limited to alcohol. Across the same period, Canadian manufacturers in sectors from autos to steel absorbed their own wave of layoffs tied to the wider tariff war. Canadian auto parts suppliers and assembly plants alone cut well over 1,000 jobs at facilities in Ontario, as manufacturers restructured around the new tariff environment. The alcohol boycott, in that sense, was never an isolated skirmish. It was one visible front in a much broader economic conflict that touched nearly every major Canadian export sector at once. But holding the line came with real logistical costs too, and Quebec's experience shows exactly what those costs look like on the ground. The SAQ, Quebec's liquor board, disclosed that it may be forced to destroy roughly $300,000 worth of American alcohol that has simply expired in storage since the ban took effect. Mostly rosé and boxed wines, ready-to-drink cocktails, and other products not suited to long-term storage. That $300,000 represents only a small slice of a much larger problem. The SAQ is currently sitting on $27 million worth of American products in warehouses purchased before the boycott that it can neither sell nor easily return. Somewhere in a Quebec government warehouse tonight, there are pallets of Kentucky bourbon and California wine that exist in a kind of bureaucratic limbo, too politically radioactive to put back on shelves, too valuable to simply throw away, at least until the mold and expiration dates force the issue. Washington's patience with that limbo ran out over the course of 2026, and the escalation followed a clear pattern of rising pressure. In February, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the original national emergency legal basis Trump had used for his initial 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, a significant legal setback for the administration's tariff strategy, and the first time that particular authority had been used this way, only to be struck down. Rather than retreat, the administration pivoted to different legal tools. By April 2026, the top U.S. trade official, Jameson Greer, was signaling publicly that existing U.S. levies on Canadian industrial goods would stay in place and could even be toughened, specifically until Canada walked back its alcohol restrictions. Alcohol, in other words, had moved from being one grievance among several to becoming the central sticking point standing between Canada and broader tariff relief. That pressure culminated on July the 20th, 2026, when President Trump signed 3 separate proclamations invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a rarely used, nearly century-old provision that allows the president to impose duties of up to 50% on goods from any country found to discriminate against American commerce. It was, by multiple accounts, the first time in the modern tariff era that Section 338 had been used this way. The White House's own fact sheet named 3 specific grievances: Canada's 25% tariff on American-made vehicles, its supply management dairy system that gave the European Union preferential access over the United States, and front and center, the provincial liquor board restrictions that had driven that 81% collapse in American alcohol exports. The new 50% tariffs were set to hit roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods across 554 separate tariff lines, with no carve-out for products that would otherwise qualify as compliant under the existing North American trade agreement. Energy, potash, fish, and critical minerals were excluded, but almost everything else, including alcohol itself, was squarely in the crosshairs. Congress joined the pressure campaign too. Legislation introduced under the deliberately pointed name the Canada Act, standing for Combating Attacks on Our National Alcoholic Drinks by Allies Act, would require the U.S. Trade Representative to formally investigate any Canadian province continuing to exclude American alcohol from its distribution system. Whether or not that bill ever becomes law, its introduction signaled something important. American lawmakers, not just the White House, now viewed empty Canadian liquor shelves as a legitimate trade grievance worth legislating over, not a minor irritant to be waited out. The proclamations were set to take effect 30 days after signing, 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on August 19, 2026, and that deadline turned the final weeks of summer into a genuine high-stakes negotiation. Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc met repeatedly with USTR Jameson Greer in Washington through late July and early August, described by multiple outlets as the third meeting between the two sides in as many weeks. Items reportedly on the table included eliminating Canada's retaliatory auto tariffs, lifting the provincial alcohol restrictions, and reworking the structure of Canada's dairy quota system. By August 7th, CBC News reported that the Canadian government was preparing to meet several core American demands, including ending the alcohol bans in exchange for tariff relief, according to government sources briefed on the talks. Hours before the original August 19th deadline, Trump paused the new 50% tariffs for 3 days, posting on social media that he was doing so based on what he described as a pending trade deal, while Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's office confirmed substantial progress had been made, but said, in Carney's own words, that important work remained. That extension pushed the real deadline to the end of the day on Friday, August 21st, essentially midnight last night, and set up one of the most closely watched final stretches of this entire 18-month saga. What happened in that final stretch tells you almost everything about how fragile Canada's unity on this issue has become, even as the country as a whole insists it is holding firm. On Wednesday, August 19th, Prime Minister Carney briefed Canada's premiers on the near final terms of the deal, and, according to multiple premiers who spoke afterward, explicitly asked all of them, as what he called a sign of good faith, whether they would agree to put American liquor back on their shelves. By Thursday, Canada's ambassador to the United States, Mark Wiseman, told roughly 100 members of the Canada-US Trade Council on a video call that restoring American alcohol to Canadian shelves was, in his words, a mandatory prerequisite for locking in the broader deal. Not a bargaining chip Ottawa could hold back. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, whose province never joined the boycott to begin with, issued a statement confirming that the Prime Minister had asked the provinces to proactively put American alcohol back on shelves as a gesture of good faith ahead of the deal's finalization, language that framed the request as voluntary, even though Wiseman's own comments to industry insiders made clear Washington was treating it as anything but optional. The Premier's reactions to that request were anything but unanimous, and that split matters because Canada's liquor stores are run provincially, not federally. Ottawa can ask, but it cannot personally restock a single shelf. Nova Scotia's Tim Houston said he was optimistic about what he'd heard, calling it a very fair deal for both countries, and noting that the core elements of Canada's dairy supply management system would remain intact. Manitoba's Wab Kinew was more reluctant, saying he was open to restocking American alcohol as part of a deal, but hoped that ordinary Canadians would simply keep choosing not to buy it. British Columbia's David Eby, whose province banned Red State alcohol outright back in March 2025, did not commit either way when asked directly, offering only a statement that Ottawa had made substantial progress across strategic sectors, a carefully vague answer that avoided the question of whether BC liquor stores would actually restock American brands. Just weeks earlier, in fact, Eby had told reporters there was, in his words, not a chance in hell that American alcohol was going back onto shelves in his province. Ontario's Doug Ford, whose LCBO represented the single largest chunk of pulled American product back in 2025, didn't answer questions from reporters about whether Ontario would restock at all. By Friday, however, Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Tony Wakeham told reporters that Canada's premiers had, in fact, all agreed to bring American liquor back to store shelves as part of the tentative deal, framing it as a unified gesture of good faith across the Federation, though several premiers still had not commented publicly by the time that statement was made. As of Friday, August 21st, according to CBC's ongoing coverage of the negotiations, American alcohol products remained off the shelves in every single Canadian province and territory except Alberta and Saskatchewan, which had never joined the boycott to begin with. That detail matters enormously because it means that even with a tentative deal reportedly finalized and premiers publicly agreeing in principle, not one bottle had actually returned to an Ontario, Quebec, or British Columbia shelf as this story was being finalized. Analysts and reporters covering the talks were blunt about the gap between a political agreement and physical restocking. As one trade analysis put it, even if a comprehensive federal level agreement gets signed, American wine, beer, and spirits will not automatically reappear on LCBO shelves in Ontario or BC liquor store shelves in British Columbia. Those are separate provincial decisions, and in British Columbia's case, the Premier had ruled it out entirely just weeks before agreeing, at least on paper, to reconsider. On Friday evening, negotiators were still meeting in Washington with the clock running out, and by multiple accounts, the two sides were, as LeBlanc put it, very close, but not yet finished. Reports emerging from those final hours suggested the deal being finalized would include reductions to American tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos, the elimination of the 10% Section 232 tariff on Canadian softwood lumber by September 1st, with anti-dumping and countervailing duties on lumber to be addressed separately in the fall, and preservation of Canada's core dairy supply management system, even as procurement rules opened up somewhat for American companies. USTR Jameson Greer told reporters outside his office that the two sides had reached an agreement that would protect American workers and jobs while strengthening the broader North American economy, framing it as a genuine win-win rather than a one-sided American victory. President Trump, for his part, suggested tariff relief was coming for Canadian exporters, telling reporters Canadian officials had been, in his words, paying a very high number. Scotiabank economist Derek Holt noted that the odds of Canada eventually securing a comprehensive, broader trade deal with Washington had risen following the week's developments, with markets responding almost immediately. The Canadian dollar strengthened on the prospect of a finalized agreement, a sign that investors at least were reading the tentative deal as a genuine de-escalation, rather than a temporary truce. Trump himself, describing the state of talks publicly on Friday, said the two countries should be able to reach an agreement, a notably more measured tone than some of his earlier comments in this dispute, when he had suggested at points that Canada might simply get a tariff, not really a negotiation, if talks collapsed. That shift in tone, from threatening a unilateral tariff to describing a deal as within reach, was itself read by trade watchers as evidence that both sides had more to lose from a failed negotiation than from a compromise neither fully wanted. So where does that leave the title of this story? Canada holds firm while America's alcohol crisis spreads. On paper, by Friday night, Canada appeared to be folding on the single issue Washington cared about most, restocking American liquor. But look closer at what holding firm actually means here, and a more complicated picture emerges. Restocking a shelf is not the same as restoring a market. The Globe and Mail, surveying Canadian readers directly on this question, found genuine uncertainty about whether ordinary shoppers would actually buy American products again even once they physically returned. Manitoba's Kainuu said the quiet part out loud. He'd allow the products back, but he was hoping Canadians simply wouldn't buy them. 18 months of habit of buying Quebec-made spirits instead of Kentucky bourbon, of BC liquor stores training customers to reach for Canadian labels, doesn't reverse itself the moment a government order changes. Sylvain Charlebois, a food and agriculture analyst who has tracked the dispute closely, warned back in July that the boycott itself was becoming a liability for Canada regardless of the outcome, giving Washington another reason to escalate trade tensions and setting a precedent that other countries could someday use public monopolies to exclude Canadian exports for their own political reasons. In that sense, both governments have reasons to want this specific fight to end, even if neither side is fully getting what it originally wanted. For American producers, even a fully successful restocking would arrive into a shrinking domestic market that has nothing to do with Ottawa. Brown-Forman can win back Canadian shelf space and still be selling into a country where barely more than half of adults report drinking at all, the lowest share Gallup has measured since before the outbreak of the Second World War. The Distilled Spirits Council's Chris Swanger put it plainly after Trump's tariff pause was announced, saying the industry wants American spirits back on shelves in every Canadian province and a return to a zero-for-zero tariff framework for spirits specifically. But getting that framework back doesn't fix the deeper problem that Americans themselves, across nearly every political and demographic group except regular churchgoers and Democrats, are simply choosing to drink less than they used to. That is the second half of this story, the half that no trade deal between Ottawa and Washington can resolve, because it isn't a trade dispute at all. It's a generational shift in how Americans relate to alcohol, running in parallel with a separate international dispute that happened, almost coincidentally, to hit the same industry at the same time. Think about what that means for a company like Brown-Forman specifically, since its situation captures both halves of the crisis at once. Even in a best-case scenario where every Canadian province fully restocks American spirits by September, Canadian shoppers return to buying Jack Daniels at pre-boycott rates, the company would still be selling into a home market where the Surgeon General has recommended new health warning labels, where younger consumers are increasingly choosing cannabis in the 24 states where it's legal instead of a drink after work, and where Gallup's own polling shows the underlying appetite for alcohol shrinking year over year, regardless of what happens at the Canadian border. Winning back Ottawa doesn't win back Louisville's other problem. Before wrapping up, it's worth being clear-eyed about what's confirmed and what's still moving. The 81% decline in U.S. alcohol exports to Canada between March 2025 and February 2026 comes directly from a White House fact sheet tied to the Section 338 proclamations, and has been corroborated by multiple outlets reporting on the same underlying trade data. Brown-Forman's 60% Canadian sales decline and Jim Beam's production suspension were reported by The Independent and corroborated across financial and trade press. The Gallup findings on American drinking rates come directly from Gallup's own July 2026 survey of 1,200 adults, with a margin of error of about 4 percentage points, released August 20th, 2026. What remains genuinely unsettled as of this recording is whether the tentative trade deal reported by CBC, CTV, The Globe and Mail, and CNN on Thursday and Friday of this week will actually be signed, whether every province will follow through on restocking American products, despite premiers like eBay and Ford offering only vague or non-committal public statements, and, perhaps most importantly for the industry itself, whether Canadian consumers will actually buy American alcohol again once, or if it physically returns to shelves. Those last three questions cannot be answered with confidence tonight, and any script that claimed otherwise would be getting ahead of the facts. What's your read on all this? Do you think Canadians will actually go back to buying American bourbon and wine once it's back on the shelf? Or has 18 months of buy Canadian habit building done permanent damage to brands like Jack Daniels and Jim Beam north of the border? And separately, is the deeper decline in American drinking itself something the industry should be more worried about than any tariff fight? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Before you go, if stories like this one, where a bottle of bourbon in a Quebec warehouse turns out to be tangled up with Supreme Court rulings, century-old tariff law, and a Gallup poll about America's drinking habits, are the kind of connected, deeply researched analysis you want more of, subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss the next one. Trade deadlines like this one tend to resolve in stages, not all at once, and there will almost certainly be a follow-up once we know whether Ontario and British Columbia actually restock their shelves, or whether this becomes another chapter in a longer standoff. If you want that follow-up the moment it's confirmed rather than finding out about it weeks later, turning on notifications after subscribing is the easiest way to catch it. And if you've made it this far into a story this dense with sourcing and detail, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. So consider sticking around, because the next deep dive into how trade policy actually plays out on store shelves and household budgets is already being researched. One last thing worth sitting with. This dispute started with a symbolic gesture in a handful of government warehouses in March 2025, and 18 months later it had pulled in the Supreme Court, a century-old tariff statute most trade lawyers had never had reason to use, a piece of legislation named after the very acronym of the boycott itself, and a completely unrelated public health survey about how much Americans drink at home. Stories like that rarely resolve cleanly in a single news cycle, which is exactly why we go back and update these once the facts change, rather than moving on and leaving you with an outdated picture. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.